The dust of Las Maderas hung thick in the air like a shroud over the living, settling on everything that dared to exist in this God-forsaken corner of the New Mexico territory. It was 1882, and civilization had crawled this far south only by the grace of railroad money and political ambition, leaving behind a town that looked more like a fever dream than a proper settlement. Abigail Whitmore stood at the tall windows of the governor's mansion, her pale hands pressed against the glass as she watched the red dirt swirl in lazy circles down the main street. The mansion itself was an oddity here, 2 stories of whitewashed adobe and imported timber that stuck out like a lady's glove in a blacksmith's shop. Her father had insisted on building it grand, declaring that even in this wilderness, a man of his station required proper accommodations. "Miss Abigail, your posture," came the sharp voice of Mrs. Cordelia Pembridge, her governess and constant shadow. The older woman's steel-gray hair was pulled so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. "A lady does not slouch, even when gazing out windows." Abigail straightened automatically, though her eyes never left the street. At 22, she had spent most of her life perfecting the art of appearing obedient, while her mind wandered to places far beyond these walls. The finishing school in Boston had taught her to walk with books balanced on her head, to speak French with the proper accent, and to play piano with the delicate touch expected of a governor's daughter. But it had never taught her how to silence the restlessness that gnawed at her like hunger. "The dressmaker will arrive shortly for the final fitting of your evening gown, Mrs." Pembridge continued, consulting the small leather book she carried like a Bible. "Tonight's reception is crucial for your father's political aspirations, as you well know." Indeed, Abigail knew. She had become quite familiar with being displayed at these gatherings like a prize heifer at auction, smiled at by men who saw not her but her father's influence, her family's wealth, the political connections that marriage to her would bring. Governor Whitmore had made his intentions clear. She would marry well, preferably to someone from back east who could strengthen his position when statehood finally came to New Mexico. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows like a living thing, and Abigail found herself longing for the cool shadows of the cottonwoods that grew along the Rio Grande. But such places were not for ladies of her station. Her world consisted of parlors and tea services, of embroidery hoops and calling cards, of endless discussions about the weather and the latest fashions from New York that arrived months out of date. A commotion in the street below caught her attention. Riders were coming into town, their horses kicking up great clouds of dust that caught the slanted light of the late afternoon sun. Most were the usual sort: cowboys from the surrounding ranches, traders heading north, drifters looking for work or trouble. But one rider made her breath catch in her throat. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, his shoulders broad beneath a faded shirt that had once been blue. A black hat was pulled low over his face, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the way he held himself with a stillness that spoke of coiled strength. At his hip rode a Colt revolver, worn with the casual familiarity of a man who'd had cause to use it more than once. As if sensing her gaze, the rider looked up at her window. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met across the dusty expanse of the street. His were the color of winter sky, pale, cold, and somehow infinitely deep. There was something in that gaze that made her feel as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed facade to the wild thing that paced restlessly in her chest. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part acknowledgement, part mockery of propriety, and rode on. "Miss Abigail, Mrs." Pembridge's voice cracked like a whip. "Step away from that window this instant. It is unseemly for a lady to gawk at common cowboys." But there had been nothing common about him. Even as Abigail obediently moved away from the window, she could feel the imprint of those pale eyes, the way he'd sat his horse with such casual confidence, the leather holster that spoke of a life lived far from drawing rooms and tea parties. "Who was that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light and disinterested. "Mrs." Pembridge sniffed. "No one of consequence. Some drifter. No doubt, the territorial marshal has been lax in keeping such unsavory elements from loitering in town. But Abigail had seen the way the other riders had given him space, the respectful distance they maintained. This was not a man who drifted aimlessly. This was a man with purpose, even if that purpose was hidden behind those watchful eyes. The afternoon wore on with its usual tedious parade of social obligations. The dressmaker came and went, pinning and adjusting the elaborate gown Abigail would wear to tonight's reception. Her mother, a delicate woman who had never quite recovered from the shock of being transplanted from Philadelphia society to this harsh frontier, fluttered in and out of the room like a nervous bird, fretting over every detail. "The Ashfords will be there tonight," her mother said, settling into a chair with her embroidery. "Their son Jonathan has just finished his studies at Harvard. Your father thinks he would make an excellent match." Abigail made the appropriate murmur of interest, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself wondering about the man on horseback, where he had come from, where he was going. There had been something haunted in those pale eyes, a shadow that spoke of things seen and done that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. As evening approached and the household bustled with preparations for the reception, Abigail allowed herself to be dressed and primped like a doll. The gown was beautiful, rose silk with intricate beadwork that caught the lamplight, but it felt like armor, each layer of propriety weighing her down until she could barely breathe. The reception was held in the mansion's grand parlor, which her father had furnished with pieces shipped at great expense from St. Louis. The territorial elite mingled with visiting dignitaries, their conversations a careful dance around the subjects that really mattered: land rights, railroad contracts, the ongoing troubles with the Apache. The ladies discussed the latest fashions and the shocking behavior of someone's daughter back east, while the men smoked cigars and made deals that would shape the territory's future. Abigail played her part perfectly, accepting compliments on her appearance, making polite conversation about nothing of importance, allowing herself to be introduced to young Jonathan Ashford, whose soft hands and softer smile reminded her of everything she was expected to want and everything that left her feeling empty. But even as she smiled and nodded and played the dutiful daughter, her thoughts kept returning to those pale eyes and the way they had seemed to see straight into her soul. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness beyond her father's mansion, under stars that burned like scattered diamonds across the desert sky, there were lives being lived with a freedom she could only dream of. She did not know then that her dreams were about to collide with reality in ways that would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. She did not know that the man with the winter sky eyes had a name, Colt Mercer, or that his past was written in blood and regret across half the territory. She only knew that for the first time in her carefully orchestrated life, she had felt truly seen. And in the weeks that followed, she would discover just how dangerous it could be to be seen by a man who slept with a gun. The first time Abigail escaped the suffocating confines of her father's mansion, it was under the pretense of sketching wildflowers for her botanical journal, a hobby Mrs. Pembridge deemed appropriately feminine and harmless. She had waited 3 weeks since the reception, 3 weeks of watching for glimpses of the mysterious rider in the streets below, 3 weeks of feeling like she might burst from the confines of her carefully ordered life. Armed with her sketching supplies and a story about studying the native flora near Miller's Creek, she had managed to slip away from her usual escort of household staff. The freedom was intoxicating, the weight of propriety falling away with each step she took beyond the mansion's manicured grounds into the wild country that stretched endlessly toward the Oregon mountains. The creek ran shallow and clear between banks lined with cottonwoods, their leaves whispering secrets in the warm afternoon breeze. Barrel cacti dotted the landscape like silent sentinels, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the endless blue sky. This was the New Mexico she had glimpsed from her window but never been allowed to truly experience. Raw, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the social conventions that ruled her world. She had been sketching for perhaps an hour when she heard the soft sound of hoofbeats on the creek's far bank. Looking up, she saw him, the man from the street, sitting his horse with that same easy confidence that had captured her attention weeks ago. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the collar of his worn shirt, the careful way his right hand rested near the grip of his colt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, filled with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and rough, like whiskey aged in oak. "Didn't expect to find anybody out here. I was sketching," Abigail replied, holding up her journal as if it were evidence of her innocence. The wildflowers by the creek. Something that might have been amusement flickered in those pale eyes. "Wildflowers, is it? Most folks in town would say this ain't no place for a lady to be wandering alone." "Most folks in town spend their days discussing the weather and the price of cotton," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I find the conversation of wildflowers more stimulating." This time, he did smile. A slow curve of lips that transformed his entire face. "Reckon you might have a point there, Miss Whitmore," she said, then immediately wondered if she should have given a false name. "Abigail Whitmore." The smile faded as quickly as it had come. "Governor's daughter," he said, and it wasn't a question. He gathered his reins as if preparing to leave. "Ma'am, you'd best be getting back. These hills ain't safe for someone like you." "Someone like me?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "What exactly do you know about someone like me, Mr.?" He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing far more than she was comfortable revealing. "Colt Mercer," he said finally. "And I know enough to recognize a bird that spent too long in a cage." Before she could respond, he had turned his horse and was riding away, leaving her standing by the creek with her heart hammering against her ribs and a dozen questions burning on her tongue. But she returned the next week, and the week after that. Always with the same excuse, always to the same bend in Miller's Creek. Sometimes he was there, sometimes he wasn't, but when their paths did cross, they began to talk, carefully at first, like two animals circling each other, testing for signs of threat or friendship. She learned that he worked at the Henderson Ranch up in the foothills, breaking horses and doing the kind of hard labor that had carved the lean strength into his frame. She learned that he had served in the war between the states, though he never said which side or what he had seen there. She learned that he slept under the stars more often than under a roof, and that he trusted his horse and his gun more than most people. He learned that she could ride better than most men, though she was never allowed to prove it. He learned that she had read every book in her father's library twice and hungered for stories of places beyond the territory's borders. He learned that beneath her refined exterior beat the heart of someone who understood the call of wild places and wide skies. The fourth time they met, storm clouds were building over the mountains, turning the sky the color of old pewter. Colt's usual wariness seemed heightened, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "You should head back," he said without preamble. "Rain's coming, and when it rains in this country, creeks turn into rivers fast enough to drown the unwary." But even as he spoke, the first fat drops were beginning to fall, striking the dust with tiny explosions that filled the air with the smell of rain on dry earth. Within minutes, the drops had become a downpour that turned the world into a gray curtain of water. "There's shelter," Colt called over the sound of the rain, pointing toward a stand of rocks where the creek curved. "Cave I've used before." They ran for it together, their horses nickering nervously as lightning split the sky overhead. The cave was shallow but dry, carved from red sandstone by centuries of wind and water. Colt unsaddled both horses with swift efficiency, his movements sure despite the dim light. "Built a fire here before," he said, indicating a circle of blackened stones. "If you don't mind the smoke." Soon, flames were dancing between them, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls and filling the small space with warmth and light. Outside, the storm raged with the fury that only desert storms could muster. But inside their refuge, time seemed suspended. "Tell me about the war," Abigail said quietly, watching the way the firelight played across his weathered features. His hands stilled where they had been whittling a piece of wood. "That ain't fit conversation for a lady." "I'm not asking as a lady," she said. "I'm asking as someone who wants to understand." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was 17 when I enlisted. Thought I knew what courage was, what honor meant. Thought war was something glorious, like in the books." He threw the piece of wood into the fire, where it caught and blazed. "Learned different, real fast." "What did you learn?" "That good men die for bad reasons. That honor don't stop bullets. That sometimes the only choice you got is between killing and being killed. And either way, something inside you dies too." The raw pain in his voice made her chest tight. Without thinking, she reached across the small space and touched his hand. He flinched as if burned, but didn't pull away. "Is that why you sleep with your gun?" she asked. His laugh was harsh. "You don't miss much, do you? Yeah, that's part of it. Hard to trust the dark when you've seen what can come out of it. But you trust me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in those pale eyes. "Maybe I shouldn't." The storm began to ease as darkness fell, the rain settling into a steady patter that drummed against the stone. Colt had removed his gun belt and set it aside, the first time she had ever seen him unarmed. The simple act felt more intimate than any declaration. "I should take you back," he said, but made no move to do so. "Not yet," she whispered, and something in her voice made him go very still. The fire had burned low, painting them both in warm gold and deep shadow. When she moved closer to him, he didn't retreat, though she could see the war being fought behind his eyes, desire and honor, want and wisdom locked in deadly combat. "Abigail," he said, her name a warning and a prayer. "I know," she said, understanding everything that word contained. She knew the consequences, knew what she was risking, knew that crossing this line would change everything, but she also knew that some hungers could not be denied. Some connections ran deeper than reason or propriety. When she kissed him, it was with all the pent-up longing of her carefully constrained life, all the wild freedom she had never been allowed to claim. He resisted for perhaps a heartbeat, then kissed her back with a fierce tenderness that spoke of his own desperate hunger for something real, something pure in a world that had shown him too much darkness. The cave walls seemed to close around them, creating a world that existed outside of time and consequence, where there was no governor's daughter and no hired gun. Only two souls who had found something in each other that they hadn't even known they were seeking. Later, as she lay in his arms listening to the rain and the steady beat of his heart, he spoke into the darkness above them. "This can't lead anywhere good," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she whispered against his chest. "Your father would have me hanged." "I know. And you'd be ruined, cast out, everything you've ever known." She lifted her head to look at him, seeing the torment in his eyes. "Do you think I care about any of that? You should, but I don't." She traced the scar that ran along his ribs with gentle fingers. "I choose this. I choose you." He caught her hand, brought it to his lips. "Then God help us both." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of washed earth and the promise of wildflowers blooming in the desert come morning. Inside their shelter, they held each other against the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring the world crashing back in around them. But for tonight, they had carved out a small piece of paradise in the wilderness. Neither of them could have imagined how quickly that paradise would turn to hell. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning that dawned bright and merciless, the kind of day that seemed to mock human suffering with its perfect blue sky. Abigail was in the morning room, pretending to read correspondence while her thoughts drifted to the hidden valley where she and Colt had been meeting for the past month, when her father strode in with the territorial newspaper folded under his arm and triumph written across his weathered face. "Excellent news, my dear," Governor Whitmore declared, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from her. Captain Theodore Langford arrives from New York next week, and I've arranged for your engagement to be announced at the territorial ball." The words hit her like a physical blow. The teacup slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the Turkish carpet in a spray of porcelain and amber liquid. "Father, Now. None of that feminine hysteria," he interrupted, waving away her protest with one meaty hand. "Langford is everything we could hope for. West Point educated, from a fine old New York family, with connections that will serve us well when statehood comes. His father owns considerable railroad interests, and Theodore himself has distinguished himself in the Indian campaigns. A fine match for a governor's daughter." Abigail felt the walls of the room closing in around her, the carefully arranged future crushing down like a landslide. "But father, surely I should meet him first. Have some say, 'You'll meet him at the ball, and I'm certain you'll find him thoroughly agreeable. His letters indicate a man of refined sensibilities and proper breeding.'" Governor Whitmore's tone brooked no argument. "The engagement announcement has already been sent to the newspapers back east. The wedding will take place this Christmas, giving us time to arrange a proper ceremony befitting your station. Christmas, 4 months. 4 months until she would be shackled to a stranger. Her life mapped out in drawing rooms and dinner parties. Her wild heart caged forever behind the bars of respectability. That afternoon, she fled to the hidden valley with desperate urgency, her horse's hooves eating up the miles between the mansion and freedom. She found Colt working with a young Mustang, his movements patient and sure as he gentled the animal to his touch. The sight of him, sun-darkened and vital, alive in a way that no drawing room full of proper gentlemen could ever be, made her chest tight with panic. "Colt," she called, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. He looked up, and whatever he saw in her face made him release the Mustang and move toward her with quick strides. "What is it? What's happened?" "My father," the words tumbled out in a rush. "He's arranged my engagement to a captain from New York. The announcement is next week. The wedding at Christmas." For a moment, Colt went absolutely still, his face becoming a mask that revealed nothing of what he was thinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I see." "No, you don't see." She caught his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I won't do it. Colt, I won't marry him. We could leave. Tonight, right now. Head west or south to Mexico. Somewhere they'll never find us." He pulled away from her touch, running a hand through his dark hair. "And then what? Abigail, you think we can just ride off into the sunset like some dime novel? You're the governor's daughter. They'd hunt us to the ends of the earth. I don't care." "Well, I do." His voice was sharp now, edged with pain. "You think I'd let you throw away everything you are, everything you could be, for a broke-down ex-soldier who's got nothing to offer but a fast gun and a slow horse? You're offering me freedom. I'm offering you a life on the run, looking over your shoulder every day, wondering when the law is going to catch up. You think you want that now, but give it a year of sleeping on hard ground and eating beans from a can, of watching decent folks cross the street to avoid us, and you'd hate me for it." Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back. "So what are you saying? That it's over? That everything between us meant nothing?" The mask slipped then, revealing the raw anguish beneath. "It means everything," he said quietly. "That's why I won't destroy your life for it." Before she could argue further, he had turned away, whistling for his horse. "I've got to get back to the ranch. Henderson's expecting me." She watched him ride away, her heart breaking with each hoofbeat that carried him farther from her. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That night, she lay awake planning, remembering stories she'd read of women who had chosen love over convention, who had found ways to forge their own destinies despite the constraints of their time. She didn't know that other forces were already moving against them, that their secret meetings had not gone entirely unnoticed. Ezra Blackwood had been watching Colt Mercer for months, waiting for the right opportunity to settle an old score. The bounty hunter had been tracking Colt ever since that business in Tucson 2 years back. when Colt had interfered with what Blackwood considered a righteous killing. A claim jumper had needed killing, and Blackwood had been hired to do it. But Colt had gotten in the way. Left Blackwood face down in the dirt with a broken jaw and wounded pride. Now Blackwood sat in the shadows of Murphy's saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the loose talk of cowboys and drifters. Information was currency in his line of work, and he'd heard enough whispers about the governor's daughter and her mysterious rides into the countryside to piece together an interesting picture. The opportunity he'd been waiting for presented itself 3 days later, when news arrived that Judge Morrison had been found shot dead in his study, a robbery gone wrong according to the territorial marshal. But Blackwood knew better. He'd been in the saloon the night before when tempers had run high over the judge's latest ruling on water rights. There had been talk, the kind of dangerous talk that sometimes led to dangerous actions. More importantly, there had been witnesses who claimed to have seen a lone rider near the judge's house around the time of the shooting, a rider matching Colt Mercer's description. Blackwood smiled as he finished his whiskey. Sometimes justice served itself up on a silver platter. The arrest came at dawn, just as Colt was saddling his horse for another day's work. They surrounded him, Marshal Pete Hawkins and 6 deputies, all armed and nervous. Hawkins was a decent man, but he knew Colt's reputation, knew what he was capable of when cornered. "Colt Mercer," Hawkins called out, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You're under arrest for the murder of Judge Samuel Morrison." Colt's hand stilled on the saddle leather. "Judge Morrison's dead. Don't play dumb with us. Colt, we got witnesses put you near his place the night he was killed." What witnesses? But even as Colt asked the question, he knew it didn't matter. In a territory where justice was often swift and sometimes wrong, witnesses could be bought, testimony could be shaped, and a man's past could condemn him faster than any evidence. He could have run. His horse was saddled, his gun was at his hip, and he'd faced worse odds before. But running would only confirm their suspicions, and more importantly, it would put Abigail at risk if they were watching him closely enough to manufacture murder charges. They might also know about their meetings. So he raised his hands slowly, letting them see he wasn't reaching for his weapon. "I'll come peaceful, Marshal, but I didn't kill Judge Morrison. That's for a jury to decide," Hawkins said, though his relief was evident. "Boys, take his gun." As the iron shackles closed around his wrists, Colt caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows of the livery stable. Ezra Blackwood touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute, his scarred face split by a grin that promised this was only the beginning. The news reached Abigail within hours. She was in the garden, trying to lose herself in the mindless task of deadheading roses, when Mrs. Pembridge came bustling out with her face flushed and her usual composure shattered. "Miss Abigail, you must come inside at once. Such dreadful news. That awful man, that gunfighter who's been lurking about town, he's been arrested for murder. They're saying he killed Judge Morrison in cold blood." The pruning shears fell from Abigail's suddenly numb fingers. "What man?" "Colt Mercer. That's his name. A hired killer. They're saying, probably sent by those ruffians who've been fighting the water rights legislation. Your father is beside himself. To think such a dangerous criminal has been wandering freely through our streets." Abigail heard no more. The world had gone white around the edges, and she had to grip the garden gate to keep from falling. Colt, arrested for murder. Colt, who had held her so gently in the cave during the storm, who spoke to horses with infinite patience, who carried the weight of old wars in his pale eyes. That evening, as the town buzzed with rumors and speculation, she slipped from the house and made her way to the jail. The building was small and squat, built of adobe and iron, designed to hold drunks and petty thieves until they could be fined or run out of town. It was not meant for men like Colt Mercer. The deputy on duty was young Tommy Morrison, the late judge's nephew, his eyes red with grief and rage. He looked up when Abigail approached, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "Miss Whitmore, you shouldn't be here. This ain't no place for a lady." "I need to see him," she said quietly. Tommy's eyes widened. See who? You can't mean, Miss, that man in there is a cold-blooded killer. He murdered my uncle. I need to see him, she repeated, and something in her voice must have warned him not to argue further. He led her back to the single cell, where a kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. Colt sat on the narrow cot, his head in his hands, and when he looked up at the sound of her footsteps, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before: defeat. Abigail. Her name was a prayer and a condemnation. "You shouldn't have come. Did you do it?" she whispered. "No." The word was flat, final. "But it doesn't matter. They need someone to hang for this. And I'm convenient. Then we'll prove your innocence. We'll find the real killer." "With what?" "I'm a drifter. A gun for hire with a reputation that speaks louder than any alibi. They'll have their trial, and they'll have their hanging, and justice will be served." His laugh was bitter. "At least it'll be quick." She pressed against the bars, wishing she could touch him, hold him, ease the pain she saw in his eyes. "I won't let them do this to you. You can't stop it, Abigail, and you gotta promise me something. Stay away from this. From me. Your engagement ball is in 2 days. Play your part, marry your captain, and forget you ever knew a man named Colt Mercer. I could never. Promise me." His voice was steel now, commanding. "Whatever else happens, don't let them drag you down with me." But even as she nodded, even as she whispered the promise he demanded, Abigail Whitmore was already planning. She had been raised to be ornamental, decorative, a pretty prize to be awarded to the highest bidder. But beneath the silk and propriety beat the heart of her frontier-born mother, a woman who had followed her husband into the wilderness and carved a life from the harsh beauty of the desert. If the law wouldn't save Colt Mercer, then she would have to do it herself. And if that meant becoming an outlaw in her own right, then so be it. Some things were worth risking everything for. Some things were worth dying for. The territorial ball was everything Governor Whitmore had envisioned, a glittering display of political power and social refinement that would cement his daughter's engagement to Captain Theodore Langford in the most public way possible. The mansion's grand ballroom blazed with the light of 100 candles, while the territorial elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers that had been shipped at considerable expense from St. Louis. Abigail stood beside her father and her intended, accepting congratulations with a smile that felt carved from ice. Captain Langford was exactly what her father had promised. Tall, handsome in a conventional way, with perfectly groomed mustaches and the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His uniform was immaculate, his conversation polished, and his manners beyond reproach. He was everything Colt Mercer was not, and that fact sat in her stomach like a stone. "You look radiant tonight, Miss Whitmore," Captain Langford murmured, bending over her gloved hand. "I confess myself the most fortunate of men to have won such a prize." A prize? The word echoed in her mind as she curtsied appropriately, playing her role in this elaborate charade. Around them, the cream of territorial society danced and drank and discussed the shocking murder of Judge Morrison with the kind of delicious horror that only touched those safe in their drawing rooms. Such a relief that they caught the killer so quickly. "Mrs." Charles Pemberton was saying to a cluster of ladies near the refreshment table. "A hired gun, they say. One of those dreadful men who sell their services to the highest bidder." "I hear he's to be tried next week," added Mrs. Jonathan Hartwell, fanning herself dramatically. "Though, really, what need is there for a trial? Everyone knows what sort of man he is." Abigail excused herself from Captain Langford's side, claiming a need for fresh air, and stepped onto the mansion's wide veranda. The night was cool and clear, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. From somewhere in the distance came the mournful call of a coyote, a sound that spoke of wild places and freedom, everything her carefully orchestrated life was not. She had spent the past 2 days investigating, using her father's extensive library and her own sharp mind to piece together what had really happened the night Judge Morrison died. The judge had been killed in his study, Shot through the heart at close range with a small caliber pistol, not the kind of weapon a professional gunfighter would choose. More telling still. Nothing had been taken except a small strongbox that had contained the judge's private papers. Someone had been looking for something specific, something worth killing for, and whoever it was had known exactly where to find it. Having second thoughts about your engagement already? Abigail spun around to find Captain Langford emerging from the ballroom, his pale eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Up close, she could see the calculation behind his practiced charm, the way his gaze lingered on her throat where her mother's pearls caught the lamplight. "Not at all, Captain," she replied carefully. "I was simply admiring the stars. They're quite spectacular here in the territory." "Indeed they are, though I confess I prefer the civilized lights of New York to all this wilderness." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair and the whiskey on his breath. "I trust you'll be equally adaptable once we're married. I have little patience for romantic notions about frontier life." There was something cold in his voice, a hint of steel beneath the polished surface that made her take an unconscious step backward. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" His smile was sharp as a blade. "Come now, Miss Whitmore. Did you think your little excursions into the countryside had gone unnoticed? Your artistic pursuits at Miller's Creek? Your fascination with wildflowers?" Her blood turned to ice. He knew, somehow. This stranger from New York knew about her meetings with Colt. "I'm afraid you're mistaken." "Am I?" He pulled a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket, flipping it open to reveal pages covered in neat handwriting. "Ezra Blackwood is quite thorough in his observations, a useful man, if somewhat unsavory in his methods." Ezra Blackwood. The name meant nothing to her, but the implications were clear. She had been watched, followed, her every move recorded by someone working for this man who was supposed to be her future husband. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Captain Langford's smile widened. "Why, nothing more than a dutiful wife who understands the importance of discretion. Your little liaison with the gunfighter was educational, I'm sure. But such indiscretions must remain in the past. I have a reputation to maintain, political aspirations to consider." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. "You killed Judge Morrison." Such a dramatic accusation. But he didn't deny it, merely tucked the notebook back into his jacket. The judge was becoming troublesome, asking inconvenient questions about certain land acquisitions, certain railroad contracts that were none of his concern. Sometimes obstacles must be removed for the greater good. And you framed Colt for it. The gunfighter was a convenient scapegoat. Men like that die all the time in the territory, shot while resisting arrest, killed trying to escape. Who would question such a thing? Abigail's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're despicable." "I'm practical." His voice remained conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "And I'm your future husband, which means you're going to be very careful about what you say and do from now on. Any attempt to interfere with the gunfighter's trial would be unwise." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm educating you about the realities of your situation. Accidents happen in the territory. Miss Whitmore, even to governors' daughters who ask too many questions." The threat hung between them like a blade, but beneath her fear, Abigail felt something else stirring, a cold rage that burned like winter fire. This man, this polished monster in a uniform, thought he could manipulate her, control her, use her as a pawn in his political games. He had killed an innocent man and framed the man she loved for it. He had spied on her most private moments, violated her with his watching eyes and calculating mind. And now he expected her to smile and play the dutiful wife while Colt rotted in jail for crimes this creature had committed. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice steady despite the fury coursing through her veins. "Excellent. I knew you were an intelligent woman." Captain Langford offered her his arm. "Shall we return to our guests? I believe your father wishes to make the formal announcement of our engagement." She took his arm because she had no choice, allowed him to lead her back into the ballroom because resistance would only confirm his suspicions. But as they rejoined the glittering crowd, As she smiled and accepted congratulations and played her part in the elaborate performance, her mind was already racing ahead to what she must do. Captain Langford thought he had won, thought he had trapped her in a web of fear and social obligation, but he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated exactly how far Abigail Whitmore would go to protect the man she loved. The formal announcement came at midnight, with champagne and cheers and all the pomp her father could muster. Captain Langford made a pretty speech about his good fortune and his devotion to his bride-to-be, while Abigail stood beside him like a porcelain doll, her face a mask of appropriate happiness. But later, after the last guest had departed and the mansion had settled into quiet, she sat in her room with pen and paper, writing letters that would change everything. One to the territorial newspaper, revealing everything she had learned about Judge Morrison's murder. Another to the federal marshal in Santa Fe, requesting an investigation into Captain Langford's business dealings. A third to her mother's brother in Colorado, asking for sanctuary if she needed to disappear. She knew the risks. Once she set these wheels in motion, there would be no going back. Her reputation would be destroyed, her family disgraced, her life as she had known it over forever. Captain Langford had made his threats clear. If she interfered, she might not live to see the consequences. But as she sealed the letters and prepared to slip from the house under cover of darkness, her thoughts turned to Colt sitting alone in his cell, condemned for crimes he hadn't committed. She remembered the way he had held her in the cave, the gentleness in his war-scarred hands, the pain in his eyes when he had tried to send her away for her own good. Some battles were worth fighting, even if you couldn't win them. Some people were worth saving, even if it damned you in the process. And as Abigail Whitmore crept through the sleeping mansion toward an uncertain future, she carried with her the memory of winter sky eyes and the promise she had made to herself in the garden, that love, real love, was worth any sacrifice. Even if that sacrifice was everything she had ever been, everything she was supposed to become. The first letter would be delivered to the newspaper office before dawn. The second would catch the morning stage to Santa Fe. The third would go with her, insurance against a future that had suddenly become as dangerous as it was uncertain. Behind her, the mansion slept on, unaware that the governor's perfect daughter had just chosen to become an outlaw in defense of love. The game had changed, and Captain Theodore Langford was about to discover that some prizes fought back. The transformation began before dawn, in the dim light of her bedroom. Abigail Whitmore shed her silk nightgown and the identity that came with it, binding her hair beneath a worn hat she had stolen from the stable boys' quarters. The dress of rough brown cotton and the men's boots she had purchased in secret hung loose on her slender frame, but they granted her something no ball gown ever had: invisibility. By the time the household stirred to life, the governor's daughter had vanished, replaced by a nameless young man who slipped through the awakening streets of Las Maderas like a ghost seeking vengeance. Her first destination was the office of the Las Maderas Gazette, where editor Marcus Webb was already at work despite the early hour. Webb was a thin, nervous man who had built his reputation on printing only the safest stories, the kind that wouldn't anger the territorial authorities or the business interests that kept his paper afloat. But the letter Abigail had left under his door changed everything. She watched from across the street as Webb read her accusations against Captain Langford, saw his hands shake as he realized what he held. The story would either make his career or end it, and for a long moment, she feared he would choose cowardice over courage. But something in her carefully documented evidence must have convinced him, because within the hour, his printing press was running, and newsboys were calling out the headline that would shake the territory to its foundations: Captain Langford accused of murder. Innocent man faces gallows. The second phase of her plan required leaving town entirely, following leads that would take her into the dangerous country south of Las Maderas, where outlaws and claim jumpers made their own law. She had purchased a horse, a sturdy mare with endurance rather than beauty, using money stolen from her mother's jewelry box. Another sin to add to the growing list that would damn her in polite society. The desert stretched endlessly before her. a landscape of red rock and thorned cacti that seemed designed to test human endurance. The September sun was merciless, and her stolen clothes quickly became soaked with sweat. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of drawing room luxuries, blistered on the reins within hours. But she pressed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that Colt's trial was set for the end of the week. She found what she was looking for at Rosario's station, a trading post and saloon that squatted like an adobe toad beside a struggling stream 20 miles south of town. The place catered to the sort of men who asked no questions and gave no names, where whiskey was cheap and life was cheaper. It was exactly the kind of establishment where someone might go to arrange a murder and frame an innocent man. The proprietor was a Mexican woman named Consuela Rosario, her face weathered by decades of desert sun and hard living. She looked up with suspicion when Abigail entered, her disguise fooling no one who had spent years reading the desperate faces of fugitives and fortune hunters. "You're lost, Nina," Consuela said in accented English, not bothering to look up from the glass she was cleaning. "This is no place for little girls playing dress-up." "I'm looking for information," Abigail replied, keeping her voice low and steady, "about a man named Ezra Blackwood." Consuela's hand stilled on the glass. "That nombre. It brings bad luck to speak it aloud. What business do you have with such a man?" "He framed someone I care about for murder. I need to prove it." The older woman studied her with eyes that had seen too much, evaluated her with the calculating gaze of someone who had survived by reading people's true intentions. Finally, she jerked her head toward the back room. "Come, but if you are playing games, Nina, if you bring trouble to my place, I will feed you to the coyotes myself." The back room was dim and stifling, filled with the smell of tequila and unwashed bodies. In the corner sat a figure that barely qualified as human, a broken-down drunk who had once been a man, his face ravaged by drink and violence until he looked like something carved from driftwood. "This is Joaquin," Consuela said. "He was there the night Blackwood met with the soldier from back east, the one with the fancy uniform and the big talk about cleaning up the territory." Joaquin looked up with rheumy eyes that struggled to focus. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, destroyed by years of cheap whiskey and desert dust. "The soldier. He paid Blackwood in gold." The old man wheezed. "Gold coins, American eagles. Told him to kill the judge, make it look like robbery. Said there was a bonus if he could pin it on the gunfighter." Abigail's heart hammered in her chest. "You saw this? You heard them talking?" "Si, I was cleaning tables, invisible like furniture. Rich men, they never see the poor." "The soldier, he gave Blackwood papers too, something about railroad contracts, mining claims. Said the judge was asking too many questions." Consuela touched the old man's shoulder gently. "Joaquin, tell her about the woman." The drunk's eyes brightened slightly. "Ah, see, there was a woman too, pretty lady, worked at Murphy's saloon. Blackwood." He bragged about watching her, following her to meetings with the gunfighter, said it would make good leverage if needed. "Ruby?" Abigail had heard the name whispered in the gambling halls and saloons. One of the painted ladies who worked the circuit between Las Maderas and Silver City. If she was still alive, she might have more information about Blackwood's arrangement with Captain Langford. But finding Ruby would mean venturing into even more dangerous territory. And time was running short. As Abigail prepared to leave Rosario's station, Consuela caught her arm. "Nina, you play a dangerous game. Men like Blackwood and his soldier friend, they do not let witnesses live. Be very careful who you trust." The warning proved prophetic. As Abigail rode north toward Murphy's saloon in Silver City, she became aware of hoofbeats following her trail. 3 riders, keeping their distance but matching her pace, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had been hired to silence her, she realized. Captain Langford's insurance against loose ends. The chase that followed was a nightmare of dust and gunfire that stretched across miles of broken country. Abigail's horse was game but not fast, and her pursuers were gaining ground with each passing hour. She had never fired a gun in anger, barely knew which end of a rifle to point at an enemy. But desperation made her resourceful. She led them through a box canyon she remembered from childhood expeditions, a place where flash floods had carved narrow passages through solid rock. The walls were high and the passage narrow, perfect for an ambush if she could manage it. At the canyon's heart, she dismounted and found shelter behind a fallen boulder, her hands shaking as she checked the loads in the rifle she had purchased along with her horse. The first rider came through the passage at a gallop, his attention focused on following her trail. Abigail's first shot missed him entirely, sending rock chips flying from the canyon wall. Her second shot caught his horse in the shoulder, sending both horse and rider tumbling into the rocky stream bed. The other two riders were more cautious, dismounting and advancing on foot with professional patience. These were not ordinary cowboys or drifters. They moved with the careful precision of men who killed for money. Abigail found herself trapped, outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to run. The battle was brief and vicious. When it ended, one attacker lay dead and another wounded, while the third had fled back the way he came. Abigail emerged from her shelter shaking uncontrollably, her clothes torn and bloody, her innocence shattered by the reality of violence. But she was alive, and more importantly, she had found what she was looking for. In the dead man's saddlebags was a letter bearing Captain Langford's seal, authorizing payment for resolving the Whitmore problem permanently. The evidence that would clear Colt's name and expose the conspiracy that reached from the territorial governor's mansion to the corridors of power in Washington. She reached Las Maderas as the sun was setting on Thursday evening, her disguise in tatters and her identity discovered by half the territory. The newspaper had done its work. Crowds were gathering in the streets, demanding answers about the allegations against Captain Langford. But she also saw wanted posters with her own face on them, offering a substantial reward for the return of the kidnapped governor's daughter. The trial was tomorrow. She had perhaps 12 hours to present her evidence and save the man she loved from the gallows. But first, she had to survive the night. Captain Langford would know by now that his hired killers had failed, that she was alive and carrying proof of his crimes. He would be desperate, cornered, and desperate men were capable of anything. As she approached the familiar streets of her childhood, Abigail Whitmore realized that the frightened girl, who had once feared breaking social conventions, was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more dangerous, a woman who had killed to protect what she loved, who had chosen justice over safety and truth over comfort. The governor's daughter was dead. What remained was something her enemies had not anticipated, a frontier woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The final battle was about to begin. The journalist found her in the ruins of the old Spanish mission, 3 miles north of Las Maderas, where the desert had begun to reclaim what man had tried to build. Abigail had sought shelter in the crumbling adobe walls as night fell, her horse exhausted and her own strength nearly spent. She was cleaning her rifle by moonlight when a shadow detached itself from the darkness beyond the broken altar. "Don't shoot," came a calm voice. "I'm a friend, or at least not an enemy." The man who stepped into the pale light was lean and weathered, with ink-stained fingers and the kind of observant eyes that missed nothing. His clothes marked him as neither cowboy nor businessman, but something in between, a man who lived by words rather than guns or gold. "Daniel Parker," he said, removing his hat. "I write for the Denver Post, among other publications. I've been following the story of Captain Langford and the accusations against him." Abigail kept her rifle ready but didn't raise it. "What do you want, Mr. Parker?" "The same thing you do. I suspect the truth." He settled himself carefully on a broken stone, making no sudden movements that might spook her. "I was in the saloon the night before Judge Morrison's murder, heard some interesting conversations about water rights and railroad contracts, started asking questions, which led me here." "And what have your questions told you?" Parker pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and opened it to reveal pages of notes, newspaper clippings, and sketches. "That Captain Langford has been busy since arriving in the territory, very busy acquiring land and mineral rights through intermediaries. often from properties owned by men who've had unfortunate accidents. He spread several documents on the ground between them, the moonlight revealing maps marked with red ink and columns of figures that told a story of systematic corruption. The railroad wants a specific route through the Organ Mountains, one that would make certain mining claims incredibly valuable. Judge Morrison discovered the connection between these claims and Captain Langford's family business interests back east. Abigail studied the papers, her mind racing as the pieces fell into place. So Morrison had to die, and someone had to hang for it. Your friend Colt Mercer was convenient, a gunfighter with a reputation. No family to ask questions, no powerful friends to demand justice. But you're asking questions. Parker smiled grimly. I'm a journalist, Miss Whitmore. It's what we do, even when it's dangerous. He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. The question is, what are you prepared to do with the truth once we have it? Together, they worked through the night, comparing evidence and building a case that would expose the conspiracy reaching from the territorial government to the boardrooms of New York. Parker had connections, other journalists, federal officials, even a few honest lawmen who hadn't been bought by Langford's gold. But more importantly, he had access to records that Abigail could never have obtained on her own. There's a federal marshal named William Hayes arriving on tomorrow's stage, Parker explained as dawn began to paint the eastern sky. I sent word to him through the telegraph office in Silver City. He's already investigating irregularities in territorial land grants. Your evidence could be exactly what he needs. But as they prepared to ride back to Las Maderas, a new problem presented itself. Smoke was rising from the direction of town, black columns that spoke of buildings burning. Even at this distance, they could hear the sound of gunfire and shouting voices. It started, Abigail whispered. The trial had been scheduled for 10 o'clock, but Captain Langford had clearly decided not to wait for legal proceedings to resolve his problems. By the time Abigail and Parker reached the outskirts of town, the situation was chaos. Armed men loyal to Langford had seized the jail and the courthouse, while an angry mob of townspeople demanded justice for Judge Morrison and the immediate release of Colt Mercer. Governor Whitmore stood on the steps of his mansion, trying to restore order while his own daughter was branded an outlaw and his future son-in-law revealed as a murderer. His political career was in ruins, his family disgraced, and his authority crumbling with each passing hour. I have to get to the jail, Abigail told Parker, checking her weapons with hands that no longer trembled. The frightened girl who had once worried about proper table settings was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some fights couldn't be won with words or social connections. That's suicide. Langford's men have it surrounded. Then I'll go through them. Parker caught her arm. There's another way. The old mining tunnel that runs under the town. It comes up in the basement of Murphy's Saloon, right across from the jail, built during the Apache troubles 20 years ago. They made their way through the chaotic streets, staying to the shadows as armed men fought running battles between the buildings. The tunnel was narrow and dark, carved from solid rock by miners who understood that sometimes survival meant going underground. It took them an hour to navigate its twisting length, emerging finally in the dusty basement of the saloon where Ruby Martinez was waiting for them. Ruby was older than Abigail had expected, her painted beauty worn by hard years and harder choices. But her eyes were intelligent and fierce, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived in a world that chewed up the weak and spat them out. Heard you were looking for me, honey, she said to Abigail. Also heard you killed 3 of Langford's boys yesterday. Not bad for a governor's daughter. I need to get to Colt Mercer, Abigail said without preamble. So does half the territory. Seems like, but Langford's got the jail locked up tight, and he's not taking any chances. Word is he plans to shoot Mercer while attempting to escape, then blame the whole mess on outside agitators. Ruby led them to a window that looked out on the street separating the saloon from the jail. The building was indeed surrounded by armed men, but Abigail could see something else. Townspeople gathering in growing numbers, their anger building like pressure in a steam boiler. The newspaper story had done its work. and public opinion was turning against Captain Langford with the fury of people who realized they had been deceived. There, Ruby pointed to a second-story window of the jail where a figure moved behind iron bars. That's where they're holding him. Guard changes every 4 hours, and there's always at least 3 men inside, as if summoned by their conversation. The jail's front door opened and Captain Langford himself emerged, his uniform still immaculate despite the chaos surrounding him. He surveyed the angry crowd with the contempt of a man who had always bought his way out of trouble, then spoke to one of his subordinates with words that didn't carry across the street, but whose meaning was clear. It was time to eliminate the witness who could destroy him. "He's going to kill Colt now," Abigail breathed, reaching for her rifle. "Wait." Parker caught her arm. "Look there, at the edge of the crowd." A new group of riders was approaching through the dust and smoke, their uniforms marking them as federal marshals rather than territorial militia. At their head rode a man whose badge caught the morning light, Marshal William Hayes, arriving ahead of schedule with the authority to override local law enforcement. But Langford had seen them too, and his face twisted with the desperation of a cornered animal. He barked orders to his men, pointing toward the jail's upper window where Colt waited. Whatever happened next, it would happen fast. Abigail made her choice in the space of a heartbeat. She burst from the saloon's door into the chaos of the street, her rifle raised and her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Theodore Langford!" she called, her words carrying across the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "I accuse you of the murder of Judge Samuel Morrison and the frame of an innocent man." Every eye turned toward her, the governor's daughter who had chosen love over duty, truth over comfort, justice over safety. In her hands she held the evidence that would destroy Langford's conspiracy, and in her heart she carried the desperate hope that love might yet triumph over corruption. The final confrontation was about to begin. There in the dusty street where 2 worlds collided, the world of political power and social convention, and the world of those who believed that some things were worth dying for. Captain Langford drew his sidearm with the practiced motion of a man who had killed before. But he had made one critical error. He had underestimated the power of a woman fighting for the man she loved. A woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The shot that rang out across the square would be remembered long after the dust settled and the dead were buried. But whether it would herald justice or tragedy remained to be seen. In the jail's upper window, Colt Mercer pressed his face against the bars and watched the woman who had risked everything to save him prepare to make the ultimate sacrifice. His chains had been broken by her courage. His name would be cleared by her evidence. But the price she might pay for his freedom was almost too terrible to contemplate. The battle for truth was about to be decided in blood and gunpowder, love and loyalty, in the harsh light of the New Mexico sun. The silence that followed Abigail's challenge stretched across the town square like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Captain Langford stood frozen, his pistol half drawn, calculating the odds of shooting his way out of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. Around him, his hired men shifted nervously, their loyalty purchased with gold that might not be enough to buy their lives in the coming storm. "Stand down, Captain," Marshal Hayes called out, his own weapon drawn but pointed toward the ground in a gesture that offered negotiation over violence. "There are federal warrants being issued for your arrest. Surrender peacefully, and you'll get a fair trial." Langford's laugh was harsh and bitter. A fair trial? From whom? These sheep who believe whatever lies they read in their precious newspaper? He gestured toward the crowd with his free hand, his face twisted with contempt. "I came here to bring civilization to this wasteland, to create something lasting and profitable from this desert. And this is my reward. Accusations from a spoiled girl who's been playing with outlaws and murderers." "The only murderer here is you," Abigail replied, stepping forward despite the gun in Langford's hand. The evidence she had gathered was clutched against her chest like armor, but she knew that papers and testimony meant nothing if she didn't survive the next few minutes. "I have witnesses, documents, proof of your conspiracy with Ezra Blackwood." Witnesses can be silenced. Langford snarled. Documents can burn. As if to prove his point, one of his men touched a torch to the courthouse steps, where flames began to lick hungrily at the wooden structure. The message was clear. If he couldn't control the narrative, he would destroy it entirely. But Governor Whitmore had heard enough. The man who had spent his career balancing political expedience with personal ambition finally faced a moment where no compromise was possible. His daughter, his headstrong, impossible, magnificent daughter, stood in the street facing death for the sake of truth, and whatever else he was still her father. "Theodore," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "This ends now. Release the prisoner, dismiss your men, and surrender to federal custody. I give you my word you'll be treated fairly." "Your word?" Langford's voice cracked with hysteria. "Your word is worthless, old man. Your daughter has made sure of that. When this is over, your political career will be finished, your family name disgraced. You'll have nothing, I'll have my honor," Governor Whitmore replied quietly. "And I'll have a daughter brave enough to risk everything for justice. That's more than you'll ever have." The insult struck home, and Langford's careful control finally shattered. He raised his pistol toward Abigail, his finger tightening on the trigger with murderous intent. But before he could fire, another voice cut through the tension, a voice rough with pain, but steady with purpose. "Langford." Every head turned toward the jail, where Colt Mercer stood framed in the doorway like an avenging angel. His chains had been struck off by Tommy Morrison, the young deputy who had finally understood that his uncle's real killer stood in the street below. Blood stained Colt's shirt from the beatings he had endured, and his face was haggard from days of imprisonment. But his hand was rock steady as it held the Colt revolver that had given him his name. "You son of a bitch," Colt said conversationally. "You killed a good man and tried to pin it on me. Bad enough, but threatening her." His pale eyes fixed on Langford with the cold intensity of a hunting wolf. "That's where you made your last mistake." Langford spun toward this new threat, his pistol swinging between Colt and Abigail as he tried to cover both targets. But he was no gunfighter, just a political schemer who had grown too comfortable with hired violence. When the shooting started, it lasted less than 3 seconds. Colt's first shot took Langford in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the dust. His second shot shattered the knee of the nearest hired gun, dropping him screaming to the ground. By the time the third shot echoed across the square, the fight had gone out of Langford's remaining men, who threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. But Langford himself wasn't finished. Wounded and desperate, he pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and aimed it at Abigail with the last of his strength. It was a small weapon, accurate only at close range, but deadly enough to kill the woman whose courage had destroyed his carefully laid plans. The shot that ended Theodore Langford's life came not from Colt's gun, but from Abigail herself. The rifle she had learned to use during her desperate flight across the territory spoke with cold finality, and Langford crumpled to the ground with his schemes and ambitions bleeding out into the New Mexico dust. For a moment, the square was utterly still except for the crackling of flames from the courthouse steps. Then the crowd erupted in cheers and shouts, a release of tension that had been building for days. Marshal Hayes and his men moved to secure the scene, arresting Langford's surviving accomplices and beginning the process that would unravel the corruption that had reached from territorial politics to the boardrooms of New York. But Abigail had eyes only for Colt, who was walking toward her with that familiar, easy stride, despite his injuries. When he reached her, she dropped her rifle and fell into his arms, feeling the solid reality of his embrace after days of fear and uncertainty. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "No," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "It's just beginning." The aftermath was swift and thorough. Daniel Parker's story, supported by Abigail's evidence and federal investigation, exposed a conspiracy that reached far beyond the murder of Judge Morrison. Captain Langford had been the point man for a scheme involving railroad interests, mining claims, and political corruption that had tentacles reaching back to Washington itself. Ezra Blackwood was found 3 days later, shot dead in a Silver City brothel by persons unknown. His death closed the last loose end in the conspiracy, though many suspected that powerful men back east had decided he knew too much to live. Governor Whitmore's political career was indeed finished, as Langford had predicted. But rather than the disgrace his enemies had hoped for, he found himself something of a folk hero, the man whose daughter's courage had exposed territorial corruption and whose own final stand had chosen principle over political survival. He retired to a small ranch north of Las Maderas, where he raised cattle and wrote memoirs that would become bestsellers in the eastern newspapers. Mrs. Pembridge departed for Boston on the first available stage, declaring that the frontier was no place for civilized people. She was not missed. As for Abigail and Colt, their future was decided in the moment when she chose to pull that trigger. There could be no return to the world of drawing rooms and dinner parties. No pretense that the governor's daughter could ever again be the prize in some political marriage. She had crossed a line written in blood and gunpowder, and there was no crossing back, but standing in the wreckage of her old life, watching the flames consume the courthouse where Colt would have been tried and executed. Abigail felt no regret. She had chosen love over security, truth over comfort, and the man whose arms held her was worth every sacrifice she had made. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the ruins of the old Spanish mission where she and Parker had planned their final gambit. It was a simple ceremony, officiated by a traveling preacher and witnessed by the handful of people who had stood with them in their fight for justice. There were no society matrons to whisper about proper protocol, no elaborate gown or crystal champagne flutes. Instead, there was desert wind carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, the sound of horses nickering in the cottonwoods, and the promise of a life lived on their own terms in a country that cared more about courage than convention. As the sun set over the Oregon mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, Colt Mercer and Abigail Whitmore rode toward their uncertain future together. Behind them lay the wreckage of old lives and old lies. Ahead lay the vast possibility of the frontier, where love and determination mattered more than bloodlines and bank accounts. They had fought for their right to be together, and they had won. The price had been everything they had once been, but the reward was everything they could become. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the darkening desert, and the sound seemed to echo their own defiant joy. Wild, free, and utterly untamed. The valley they chose lay nestled between 2 ridges of the Oregon Mountains, hidden from casual travelers but blessed with a clear stream that ran year-round and grass sweet enough to fatten cattle. It was here, 6 months after the gunfight that had freed them both, that Colt and Abigail Mercer built their new life from adobe bricks and determination. The ranch was modest by the standards of her father's mansion, a simple house with thick walls and deep windows designed to keep out the desert heat, a barn for the horses they trained and sold to neighboring spreads, corrals built from ocotillo poles that Colt cut himself from the hillsides. But it was theirs, earned with sweat and paid for with the reward money the federal government had given Abigail for exposing the Langford conspiracy. On this particular morning in late spring, she stood in the doorway watching her husband work with a young Mustang in the breaking pen. The colt was a beauty. Deep chestnut with 4 white socks and the kind of spirit that could either make a fortune or kill the man trying to tame it. Colt moved around the animal with infinite patience, his voice low and soothing as he gentled it to the feel of rope and saddle. 6 months of ranch life had changed them both. The pale, sheltered girl who had once worried about proper table settings was gone, replaced by a woman whose hands were calloused from honest work and whose skin had been kissed gold by the desert sun. She could shoot straighter than most men, cook over an open fire, and deliver a foal in the middle of a spring storm. The skills she had learned during her desperate flight from Las Maderas had become the foundation of a new identity. Colt, too, had found peace in this hidden valley. The haunted look that had shadowed his pale eyes for years had softened into something that almost resembled contentment. He still wore his gun. The frontier was too dangerous for such foolishness as going unarmed. But he no longer slept with his hand on the grip. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war came less frequently now. And when they did, Abigail was there to hold him through the darkness until dawn brought its own healing. "Coffee's ready," she called, wiping her hands on the apron that had replaced silk gowns in her daily wardrobe. He looked up from the Mustang and smiled, that slow curve of lips that had first captured her attention in the streets of Las Maderas a lifetime ago. "Give me 5 more minutes with this young devil, and I'll be right in." She watched him work, marveling as she always did at the transformation that came over him with the horses. The violence that had marked his earlier life fell away, replaced by something gentle and sure. He understood these wild creatures because he had been wild himself, had known the fear of the rope and the longing for freedom that drove them to fight against captivity. The Mustang finally allowed the saddle on its back, though its eyes still rolled white with nervous energy. Colt patted its neck with satisfaction and headed toward the house, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. "He'll make someone a fine horse," Abigail said as he settled beside her on the wooden bench they had built outside their front door. "Strong enough for ranch work, fast enough for the cavalry. Already got a buyer lined up." Colt replied, accepting the tin cup of coffee she handed him. "Major Stevens at Fort Bayard wants him for his personal mount, paying top dollar too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the eastern peaks and listening to the sounds of their small kingdom, horses nickering in the pasture, cattle lowing in the distance, the liquid song of a meadowlark greeting the morning. It was a peace hard-won and deeply treasured by two people who had known too much of violence and uncertainty. A dust cloud on the horizon caught Abigail's attention, resolving itself into a familiar figure on horseback as it drew closer. Daniel Parker dismounted at their gate, his journalist's eyes taking in the improvements they had made since his last visit. "Colt, Abigail," he greeted them, accepting a cup of coffee and a seat on the bench. "Place looks good, prosperous. We're getting by," Colt replied carefully. In their world, it didn't pay to advertise success too loudly. There were always those who would try to take what others had built. Parker pulled a newspaper from his saddlebags and spread it on his knee. The headline read, "Territorial Statehood Approved. New Mexico to Join Union." Below it was a smaller story about the continuing investigation into railroad corruption and the reforms that had grown out of the Langford scandal. "Thought you'd want to see this." Parker said, "Your father's work with the Statehood Committee paid off. They're saying he'll likely be New Mexico's first elected senator when the time comes." Abigail felt a flutter of pride mixed with old sadness. She and her father had reconciled in the months after the trial, but the relationship would never be the same. Too much had changed, too many bridges burned for there to be any return to the way things were. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "He deserves recognition for choosing principle over politics when it mattered." "What about you two?" Parker asked. "Any thoughts of returning to civilization now that your names have been cleared?" Colt and Abigail exchanged a look that needed no words. They had discussed this possibility during the long winter evenings, weighing the appeal of respectability against the freedom they had found in their mountain valley. "This is civilization," Abigail said finally. "At least, it's the only kind we're interested in." Parker nodded as if he had expected that answer. "I thought you might say that. Just remember, there are people back east who consider you both heroes. If you ever change your minds, you'd be welcome in more places than you might think." After Parker left, they returned to their daily routines, Colt working with the horses while Abigail tended the garden she had planted behind the house. The vegetables were coming along well despite the challenging soil, and she took pride in the neat rows of corn, beans, and squash that would see them through the coming winter. That evening, as they had every evening since arriving in the valley, they sat by their fire and talked about the day's work, the plans for tomorrow, the dreams they were building together. The conversation was easy and familiar, seasoned with the kind of comfortable intimacy that grew between two people who had chosen each other freely and paid the full price for that choice. "Sometimes I dream about the old life," Abigail confessed as she mended a torn shirt by firelight. The parties, the dresses, the sense that everything was planned out and certain. "Do you miss it?" Colt asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," she replied without hesitation. "I miss the certainty sometimes, the feeling that the future was predictable. But I wouldn't trade this," she gestured around their simple home, "for all the mansions and ball gowns in creation." Colt reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses that marked her transformation from governor's daughter to rancher's wife. "The dream I never dared to have," he said quietly, "was this: a home, a woman who chose me knowing exactly what she was getting, a place where the past doesn't matter as much as what we build together." "And I choose this dream," she replied, lifting a scarred hand to her lips. "Every morning when I wake up, every evening when we sit by this fire, every moment in between, I choose you. I choose this life. I choose us." Outside their circle of firelight, the desert night was alive with its own music. The yip of coyotes calling to their mates, the rustle of wind through sage and juniper, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. It was a harsh country that demanded strength and courage from those who would make it home. But it was also a country that rewarded such qualities with freedom beyond anything the civilized world could offer. As they prepared for sleep, Colt set his gun on the table beside their bed, not from fear, but from habit born of years when survival had depended on such precautions. The gesture was automatic now, as much a part of their evening routine as banking the fire or checking the horses. But for the first time in years, when he closed his eyes, Colt Mercer wasn't listening for the sounds of danger in the darkness. Instead, he was listening to the soft breathing of the woman beside him, the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his peace. And in that peace, in that simple adobe house in a hidden valley where love had conquered fear and truth had triumphed over lies, two people who had risked everything for each other finally found the happiness they had fought so hard to claim. The dream they had built together was worth every sacrifice, every moment of danger, every price they had paid. It was a dream written not in gold or glory, but in the daily choices of two hearts that had refused to be separated by convention, corruption, or the cold calculations of a world that had never understood what they meant to each other. Some stories end with victory fanfare and public celebration, but the best stories, the ones that matter, end quietly, in the moments between one breath and the next, when two people who have found each other against all odds finally have the chance to simply be, and in the silence of the desert night, with stars scattered like promises across the infinite sky, Colt and Abigail Mercer slept peacefully in each other's arms, their guns within reach but their hearts finally, completely at rest. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale of love and courage in the wild frontier. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story from tonight? Whether you're in a cozy cabin, a city apartment, or perhaps your own patch of wild country, drop a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of hearts that dared to love against all odds. And share your thoughts about Colt and Abigail's journey with fellow listeners. Until next time, may your own dreams be worth fighting for.